Hello, my name is Christopher Sands and a senior fellow with the Hudson Institute with a few thoughts on the G8 meeting in Italy, July 8 and 9. G8 leaders met with high expectations that they would tackle economic topics, climate change, and also have some thoughts on the growing turmoil in Iran. In each of these areas, the G8 leaders disappointed somewhat, leaving many of the difficult issues to be determined later. Starting with the economy. One of the big topics for all of the European leaders and our allies in Canada and Japan was growing protectionism in the United States and a concern on the part of developing countries that protectionism in the North, for whatever reason, whether it was straight old-fashioned tariff protectionism or a more modern approach to protectionism in order to advance climate change goals, would wreck the global economy. Many had raised in newspapers and publications specters of the Great Depression and the role that collapsing international trade had on the global economy overall. So when the leaders met in Italy of the G8, they began discussing what to do with the Doha round of World Trade Organization talks, which have been stalled now since the late Bush administration. The leaders pledged to do more to get the Doha round going. However, their pledges were empty. There were no specific commitments made, only a decision that prior to the G8 meeting, the G20 meeting, in Pittsburgh in September, they would try to develop a more concrete plan to get those talks going again. Vague promises probably not enough to reassure the markets at a time when commodity prices have been up and down and overall trade has been shrinking worldwide. The second major challenge for the G8 countries was to provide some leadership in the climate change debate. The Copenhagen, UN-sponsored Copenhagen talks at the end of 2009, November, December, provide the next big global stage for discussion of climate change talks. Going into the G8 meeting in Italy, the leaders knew that they had one major challenge. Developing countries like China and India, who sat out the Kyoto round, were only prepared to come to the table and make serious reductions or commitments for serious reductions in carbon emissions if the industrialized countries were able to make much more dramatic commitments up front so that as they developed, they wouldn't be paying the price in terms of their own economic growth. That is to say, China and India wanted to make sure that first industrialized countries, who are their biggest competitors, made serious cuts, and then, and only then, would China and India take these talks seriously. At the same time, in the United States, the Waxman-Markey bill, passed in the House of Representatives and moving on now to the Senate, promises very modest reductions, only 5% carbon reductions by the year 2020. This, when the Europeans felt that a 30% reduction by 2020, again over 1990 levels, would be necessary in order to make a good start on climate change talks. In the end, the G8 leaders promised that by 2050, they would make an 80% reduction in their emissions over the 1990 levels. Two major points about those pledges. First, the timetable has now been so stretched that none of the current leaders will be in office in 2050 when those pledges come due. So this was a promise on someone else's watch to fulfill a grand goal. Secondly, the leaders talked only about technology as a means to try to reach those reductions. There are no concrete proposals that could make those kind of massive changes now. The hope is that technology will deliver these cuts in time. This puts a bright face on what is a hard reality. Without the United States able to make substantial cuts itself to its carbon emissions, other countries, including Europe and Asia, are unwilling to make those cuts themselves. And so the likelihood is that going into Copenhagen, we should lower our expectations or continue to stretch timelines out into the distant future, because in the short run, the U.S. in particular is unwilling to lead in this area. And that leads us to our third area, which is dealing with Iran. The G8 leaders promised new resolve on Iran, but very few specifics. They talked about the need for Iran to treat its journalists more carefully, and also to treat foreign journalists with greater respect, to release political prisoners, and to end the violence against protesters. All good sentiments, to be sure. But there were no new sanctions announced, and with the President's talk of a nuclear power summit, one that would bring together the nuclear weapon states to talk about arms reductions, following up on the President's unilateral commitments or bilateral commitments with Russia to reduce the U.S. nuclear arsenal, suggested that in the end, even Iran would not pay a high penalty even for its pursuit of nuclear weapons. All in all, it was a fairly timid response to the Iranian violence, and one that seemed unworthy of these leaders who, in their own national politics, had sounded so much tougher. The G8 meeting in Italy ends July 9, with the next meeting scheduled for Canada in Huntington, Northern Ontario. But it will be interesting to see whether those talks are any more productive. The larger debate about the G8 remains. Is it a useful group of countries? Would the G20, which is more inclusive, be more valid? Or should an even smaller group be formed to move forward? The G8 summit in Italy suggests that the particular group of countries that met in Italy this time round was neither the right number of countries to get things done, nor the right mix of countries with enough political will to really bring back achievements on the issues that concern the globe. It may be time for reform of international institutions as a result. My name is Christopher Sands, with a few thoughts from the Hudson Institute.